Dorothy Thompson meant a great deal to a number of the people who actually still serve on the committee, although the legacy carries on beyond that. She was, for many of us, a personal friend and a personal exemplar of courage. She was a university attorney who was given the challenge of crafting our first affirmative action plan, and she was also our first affirmative action officer at the university. She also managed the very delicate matter of trying to craft a culture in which we could deal with the issues of harassment, both sexual and racial, within the university community. She always felt that what she was doing was a piece of a much larger issue in our culture, and that what she was doing was making a positive contribution to one aspect of something that just was a very serious and deep and profound issue for us all in our larger community. And she approached her tasks at the university with a profound commitment to civil rights for all citizens in all circumstances. And we in the committee, when, as a matter of fact, Clyde first mentioned, why not bring Mayor Knight from Wichita here, we could think of actually no more exemplary kind of talk in the Civil Rights Lecture Series than what he is going to present to us tonight. So it was a great idea, and we're very glad to be doing it. That's all I'm going to say at this point, except that I'm going to introduce our mayor, Karen McCullough of Manhattan, who will introduce their mayor.
Thank you, Jim. Dorothy Thompson was a very good friend of mine. I taught her how to play hearts, and she very quickly learned and stuck me with the Queen of Spades every time she could. We're really very pleased to have Bob Knight with us tonight. Bob was first mayor in 1981, mayor of Wichita, and has been mayor repeatedly. He was Secretary of Commerce for Kansas from 1992 to 1994, and then went back to Wichita and has been mayor there since 1995. Bob is presently president of the League of Cities, and as the students that I work with at the library would say, this is a very big deal. The League has about 1,600 members. Manhattan is a member. We just mentioned that we're going to be meeting in Boston in December. And as president of the League of Cities, each president has the right or is allowed to pick an agenda. And we are delighted that Bob has picked the issue of racism. A year ago, last May, I went to a community building seminar in Orlando that was directed by the previous president of the League of Cities, Clarence Anthony. And after 3 or 4 days of working together and discussing the issue of communities, it became very clear that the main thing impeding community growth is racism. There are other issues. There's NIMBYism. There's a lack of a civic press. There are many other issues. But the one that stood head and shoulders above all was the issue of racism. And so I am looking forward to hearing what Mayor Knight has to say, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming him to Manhattan.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Mayor McCullough. Also, I would like to recognize Bruce Sneed, who will, he's here someplace, or he was. He's out trying to drum up enough votes to be Karen's successor in April. I also want to express my appreciation to Professor Hamilton for the time that he spent with me this afternoon, guiding me around and taking care of me. Sheila Hockhauser, worked with Sheila. She was in the state legislature when I was Secretary of Commerce, and how fortunate you are to have had her service really a superb intellect, but just a fine, fine human being. For those of you that don't know me, and I'm sure that's the majority of the people here, I didn't coach at Indiana University, and I still have my job, at least as recently as 3 o'clock this afternoon, but things can change fast in Wichita. I'm very pleased to be in Manhattan, Kansas. I do have to admit, several months ago, when Mr. Howard called me, the likelihood of me being here was really quite remote because of the amount of travel I've been doing the last year. However, I went home and talked to my wife, who used to work with Clyde, and told her of our conversation. And given the fact that she graduated from K-State and my 3 daughters all attended K-State, 2 of whom managed to graduate from here, my son-in-law is a graduate of K-State. My brother-in-law and sister-in-law, Rod and Susie Olson, well, at least Susie graduated from K-State. I think Rod is still taking correspondence courses. They're the 2 children of college age. Their children graduated from K-State. My father-in-law graduated from K-State. The list goes on and on, brother-in-laws and sister-in-laws. So once all of this was factored in, I told them that I would be very pleased to come to Manhattan and spend a few minutes here. I was advised at the start that these lectures usually last around an hour, and I can assure you what I have to say won't take an hour. I will try to be as succinct as I know how. What I would like to do is to spend 15 or 20 minutes in a conversation with you about something that has taken on a tremendous significance in my life, and I'm sure that it's important to all of you. This university has a very special standing in our state and even in our nation. Last Saturday afternoon, I was speaking to the American Bar Association in Scottsdale, Arizona, and one of the attendees came in and made the statement that the OU K-State game was on and gave me a score. And it was a very lopsided score, and he said that OU was winning. And he was from Oklahoma, so I assumed that he wasn't telling me the truth. And I repeated the score just the reverse to the audience, so they left there with the wrong information. But under any event, this great institution has been found to be tried and true over many, many years, which reminds me of an event that occurred not too long ago, about a year ago, when my parents were celebrating their 58th wedding anniversary. And I want to explain to you that they're both very special people, and of course they're loved very much. You should also know that my father's in his mid-80s and has experienced failing health for several years, including significant hearing loss. Anyway, we were having a very wonderful, memorable celebration, and at one point in the evening we started having toasts. And after 5 or 6 toasts, my mother rose and raised her glass, and she looked at my father, who was sitting at the opposite end of the table. She said, "I've been married to you for 58 years. I love you very much, and I have found you to be tried and true." My father-in-law reached over to me and he said, "What'd she say?" I said, "Dad, Mom said that she's been married to you for 58 years. She loves you very much, and she has found you to be tried and true." He looked at me and he said, "Well, you tell your mother that I've been married to her for 58 years, and I'm tired of her too." So my parents were divorced later that week, and just kidding. It's good to be here. As the mayor was telling you, I do have the privilege this year of leading the National League of Cities. And it is the largest and the oldest municipal organization in the world. And my privilege this year is the first time an elected official from Kansas has been able to represent this state at that level. We do have about 1,700 direct member cities, ranging in size from New York City to a community in California, I think, has several hundred people. But in addition to those 1,700 cities, we represent 18,000 more communities through state organizations, and we represent about 140,000 or 150,000 elected officials. We have an outstanding staff in Washington, D.C., 110 or 120 very talented people that monitor the proceedings of the federal government very closely and serve our nation's cities as effective and, I think, respected advocates. As the mayor mentioned, I had an opportunity to pick an issue. It's been several years ago now. It was a year before I took over as president. And I thought an awful lot about that and went through various exercises trying to determine what I wanted to direct the interest and the skills of this organization toward. And I concluded that I wanted the topic that I selected, racism. But I only chose that with the understanding that that magnificent institution would sustain the interest and the focus on this issue after I left. And they were very agreeable to that. And my successor at the National League of Cities will be Mayor Dennis Archer from Detroit. He is very agreeable to it, and his successor is a mayor from the Minneapolis, Minnesota area, and she is agreeable to it. So it's not one of these things that I think you can have a couple of press conferences and say that you've done your job and walk away. Obviously, this subject does not lend itself to that, and if I didn't have that commitment, I wouldn't have chosen it. The same thing with the city of Wichita. If our community wasn't willing to make a sustained, concerted effort to have our citizens discuss this topic over a period of years, I wouldn't have brought it up in the fashion that I have. So I want you to know up front that I am not professing to have all the answers. I remember reading about Arlo Guthrie in Alice's Kitchen. He said, if you want to change the world, you have to sing real loud. Well, I've really come to believe that maybe my role is to sing real loud about this subject and try to draw attention, by the way, to a subject that many sectors in America don't want to talk about. I believe that we're living clearly during one of the most exciting times in human history. Change and challenge and opportunity wind through our lives at a pace and at a velocity that's unparalleled. If the future of Manhattan, Kansas, Wichita, Kansas, or any other city in Kansas, any other city in our nation, or really any other city in the world, is to be a future of hope and promise, I think we have to identify this change that's blowing so forcefully through our lives, interpret this change correctly, and then, hopefully in a very thoughtful and bold way, to confront the reality of that change. During the coming years, globalization is going to continue to reshape society and governments more profoundly than the Industrial Revolution and the Progressive Era combined. Cities can fight the changes and die. They can accept the changes and survive, or they can choose to lead and thrive. I've concluded that I want to be part of the effort to lead and hopefully prosper. But that will require an enormous commitment of citizens pulling together, and therein lies a major challenge for any city that I'm familiar with. We have so many forces trying to separate us, trying to segment us, to drive wedges between us. As a matter of fact, it even seems so normal particularly during the political season we're in now. And even though we're in it now, it has become almost a continual process. We use labels such as rich and poor, Democrat and Republican, liberal, conservative, rural, urban, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, Hindu, white, black, red, yellow, brown, male, female, labor, management, and the list goes on and on and on. These labels are intended to tell us very quickly just about anything you want to know about another person. However, I believe that that type of thinking can obscure as well as clarify. This kind of shorthand can also smother and suffocate our miraculous potential and individuality. Let me briefly tell you a story about a friend of mine to illustrate this point. I had a friend who was in San Francisco on a business trip and was enjoying some free time by walking across the Golden Gate Bridge. As he was walking across the bridge, he noticed a man about to jump off to what would certainly have been his death. My friend rushed up to him and tried to dissuade him from committing suicide and told him simply that God loved him. A tear came to the eye of the distraught man, and my friend then asked him, "Sir, are you a Christian? Are you a Jew? Are you a Muslim? Or are you a Hindu? What faith are you?" And the man replied that he was a Christian. And my friend said, "Well, me too. Protestant or Catholic?" The man replied, "I'm a Protestant." And my friend said, "Well, that's a small world. Me too. What denomination?" And he replied, "I'm a Baptist." And my friend's eyes widened and he asked, "American Baptist, Southern Baptist, or Northern Baptist?" And the man was becoming very agitated and he replied, "I'm a Northern Baptist." And my friend said, "Well, me too. That's amazing. Northern Conservative Baptist or Northern Liberal Baptist?" And the man responded in a very sharp tone. He said, "Northern Conservative Baptist." My friend said, "I don't believe it. Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist or Northern Conservative Reformed Baptist?" The man was tiring of this questioning and he replied, "Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist." And my friend said, "This is remarkable." He gripped the struggling man's hand very tight and asked, "Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes region or Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Eastern region?" The man's resistance was now reversing, and he replied, "Well, I'm a Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes region." My friend yelled out, "Praise be to God. This is truly a miracle. My brother, are you a Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes region of 1879 or a Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes region of 1912? The man was now struggling to climb back over the rail to my friend, and in a voice filled with excitement he answered, "My friend, my brother, I am a proud, redeemed, Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes region of 1912. And my friend looked him in the eye, knowing all he needed to know, and said, "Die, you heretic," and pushed him over to his death. So I suppose the moral of the story is that sometimes, regardless of how hard we try, we can't conform to people's expectations and their labels. As I mentioned earlier, we face challenges and opportunities today that would have been incomprehensible as recently as 10 or 15 years ago. Now, many are finding these circumstances exhilarating, while others are finding the pace of change disconcerting and daunting. As we meet this evening on October 19, 2000, we outwardly appear to be doing very well. Our nation is in one of the longest periods of prosperity in our history. The city of Wichita's full-throttle economy is arguably the strongest in my lifetime, and I would assume that Manhattan is doing equally well. And we have more people working in our state today than any time in our history. If you would couple all of this with the breathtaking scientific advancement that's occurring, this leads many of us to agree and accept the fact that many of our national leaders are proudly proclaiming that all is well and let the good times roll. Unfortunately, this is not necessarily the case, and there are potentially serious fault lines in our social, in our political, in our moral, in our environmental, in our economic landscape that makes our world clearly uncertain at best. Few, if any, institutions are immune from these uncertainties, including local governments. I believe that many of our political institutions in America are being seriously affected by the political climate that has been unfolding. I think that it can even be argued that our system of government is unraveling and adrift. Perhaps we need to consider whether the ideologies and the policies of liberal and conservative have run their course and have come to a dead end. Bill Moyers, who is a noted journalist on PBS, has written that the American people have a desire to transcend old paradigms of politics, a deep, heartfelt yearning to go beyond the left and the right, to go beyond the passions of both the conservative and the liberal movements as they have been manifest in our time. He goes on to give a very detailed and compelling analysis as to why. It seems to me that if we desire a hope-filled future, we must look for effective ways to move to a common ground with each other. Many believe, and I agree, that the only way we're going to find common ground in our divisive society is to move to a higher ground. Contemporary politics, with all their factional interests, will not lead us to that higher ground. Politics and government of this sort has been reduced to the selfish struggle for power among competing interests and groups instead of a process of searching for the common good or that higher ground. I believe, and I even saw it was in the brochure, I believe that deep within our souls exists the conviction that politics and morality are inextricably linked. We need a politics that offers us a vision of transformation and reconciliation. It's time that the political bodies in this nation quit twisting and manipulating citizens for politically self-serving and ideological purposes. John Gardner, who was formerly a member of the Johnson administration and chairman of Common Cause, has written that the real political leadership is where you lead people to where in their best selves, in their heart of hearts, they really want to go. Would not most of you agree that we are at a critical juncture in our history? Profound moral, economic, social, and environmental challenges lie before us, and it's at a time that cries out for a different path, a new direction, an alternative vision. I guess there are a series of questions you could ask, but two questions would be, where are those visions, and who will the visionaries be? I humbly suggest that they will in part be some of us assembled here tonight in Manhattan, Kansas, men and women who have committed their time, their effort, their aptitude and concern to serving their neighbors where they live. All of us must reflect on the challenges and opportunities that we're called to confront. I have traveled throughout this nation. I have literally crisscrossed it back and forth. And I'm in Manhattan, Kansas tonight because I want to join with everyone else who is seeking new possibilities in community building, democratic participation, and political empowerment that can and will, I believe, transcend contemporary political straitjackets. I believe, like so many others, that increasingly that individual participation and adjusting social policy might be several keys to change. And this is largely the reason for my selection of undoing racism as my focus this year. It has been my hope to galvanize hundreds of cities across America around this project. On September 20th, which was about a month ago, we had a rally in Washington, D.C., and we had over 400 cities represented and made a commitment to this initiative. Now, that may not sound like much in a nation of 260 million, but those 400 cities really added up to an amazing amount of America. And those people and I met on the anniversary, the 150th anniversary of the day that slave trade was outlawed in Washington, D.C. So there is a thirst. I think there is a response going on. Admittedly, it's still a small ripple. Tonight, we know that there are many issues to divide us, but I would argue that there are none more toxic or malignant than racism. It affects societies around the world, and Wichita, Kansas is no exception. And you can make your own conclusions concerning Manhattan. Let me try to briefly summarize my views on the subject. Again, I don't profess to be an expert. I am not a sociologist. I'm not an academician, but I can tell you what I've learned certainly over the last 21 years in government. First of all, I believe it's a fact that since they first set foot on this continent, men and women of color have been speaking with an unambiguous passion and clarity for full participation and inclusion. Regrettably, we whites have so often mumbled, stumbled, and stuttered in response. Instead of embracing those foundational principles to which every American has emotionally committed by virtue of the promise that we're all created equal, their clear, heartfelt plea has in many ways fallen on deaf ears. This denial has such profound implications that it may well represent one of our nation's, and certainly one of our city's, core challenges. As I mentioned earlier, outwardly we appear so prosperous, so robust, and so healthy, while inwardly many of our citizens are seriously wounded and dying, much like a physically powerful athlete struggling with an incurable cancer. All too often, the color of one's skin determines where they live, where they worship, where they work, where they play, their associations, their opportunities. It has a dominant influence on their lives. This mocks everyone's right to expect that their talents, their abilities, and their diligence, not the prejudice of others, will determine the nature of the lives they live. It is so obvious that we as a nation are uneasy to confront one another around the issue of race. We are afraid of unleashing pent-up anger, disappointment, frustration, resentment, and pain. I've only barely touched on this, and I can tell you that my experience has exposed me to some of the finest, most noble impulses that can emanate from human beings. It is uplifting, it is encouraging. I will also tell you that I've experienced some of the basest, some of the most hate-filled, some of the most violent, virulent responses imaginable. It is that kind of issue, and that's why people, by and large, avoid it. I've been asked many times this year around this country why I, a white guy who's a Republican from Kansas, picked this issue to focus on. I selected it primarily because it represents, as I told you earlier, the major unresolved social issue in our society. And those of us like me who say we care and are white, we need to stop leaving the task of addressing racism to our friends and our neighbors of color. I want to be perfectly clear. I am not presenting myself as one who has led the perfect life on this subject. Unfortunately, that is not the case. I have said things and done things in my life that I wished I could go back and undo, and of course that's not possible. I've also remained silent at times when I should have spoken up. So I'm no poster boy on this subject, and I want to acknowledge these shortcomings and express my profound sorrow for any intentional or unintentional circumstance where I hurt another human being. I've tried to make some kind of disclaimer everywhere I speak, and Karen and others may have heard it. I will tell you, I have never considered myself a racist, but it is interesting how other people interpret words. I have a friend, an African-American council member in Lubbock, Texas. He is an amazing man. Not only is he one of the leaders in Lubbock, which is a city of several 100,000 people, but he also is the minister of a church in Lubbock. So this man really inspires people. And he called me up 3 or 4 months ago, and he said, "Bob, I want you to come to Lubbock. We're having some racial challenges here, and I would like for you to come and speak to our city council, to our school board, to our county commissioners, to the business leaders, and some of the not-for-profits in Lubbock." I said, "I can't do it." And anyway, make a long story short, he was unrelenting. And so scheduled a quick trip to Lubbock. I arrived at Lubbock, was picked up at the airport, went to the hotel where they had me staying, and they had a paper on the desk. And I picked it up, and there was a front page story. Former racist is going to speak in Lubbock. So I get on the phone, and I call this guy, and I said, "TJ, I was referred to as a former racist." I said, how did you arrive at that conclusion?" He said, "Well, you mentioned the fact that you hadn't been perfect on this subject." And I said, "Okay, whatever." So I guess I'm a former racist. I haven't looked at it quite that way. But anyway, I think it's very important for all of us to take an inventory of our attitudes, how we respond. Perhaps most of you have lived more exemplary lives, but even when we're not aware of wrong actions or harboring such feelings ourselves, don't all of us recognize that they exist in others? Our natural tendency is to hold our feelings in check in the hopes that somehow they will simply fade away. Well, it's been my experience that they won't. Tangled emotions and inexplicable behavior are the inevitable byproducts of our nation's unresolved racial past. And it's my view that until we deal with them, the writer who wrote the following is correct. And he wrote that we resemble peasant villagers who continue to build on the slopes of an ancient but active volcano. Sooner or later, that volcano is going to erupt. And sooner or later, our cities will erupt. We have run away from race for far too long. We will never achieve racial healing, in my judgment, if we're unwilling to confront each other, to take risks, to make ourselves vulnerable, to put aside pride, to say all the things we're not supposed to say, to remove the masks that conceal our deepest feelings. In short, to be honest and put on the table all of our hopes and our fears and our dreams. My experiences have led me to conclude that public policy has moral implications, and I don't think there's any better example of this issue of race. Most of the world's great religions teach that humankind, every single human being, is created in the divine image. And I think that most foundational premise gives each person an equal and sacred value. The truth is that there is something terribly wrong in America. And up until now, in most of our communities, we have what appears to have condoned the injustice, to tolerate the suffering, and we have just seemingly accepted it. As a nation, that is unacceptable. As a city, that is unacceptable. And as human beings, that is unacceptable. The majority of us have simply looked the other way and made sure that our security and well-being and that of our family and people that we love are assured. There is more than enough blame on this subject to go around. The question is who will take responsibility. I hope that's where all of us come in. Bill Bradley called racism our nation's original sin. and I think that is very apt. But our nation's original sin, as he describes it, must be faced in a way that we have really never done before. Only then can America, in all of her cities and all of her people, reach their potential. And only then can we hold to our nation's founding principle, which is all men, and implied all women, are created equal. Many years ago, in a speech at Lincoln University, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. confessed to being what he called a maladjusted person. He said that he simply had not been able to adjust to a world of discrimination, that he had not been able to adjust to economic conditions that left a few with luxuries and so many, many without even basic necessities. And Dr. King concluded that the salvation of the world might well rest in the hands of the maladjusted. So I guess my song and my message is that I'm here tonight to ask all of you to join me and countless others across this country in being maladjusted, that we will no longer adjust to an America or any city or community where hate crimes still occur, that we will never adjust to an America or any city where discrimination persists, that we will never adjust to an America or any community where too many of our fellow human beings are abused or exploited, and that we will never adjust to an America or a community where any citizen is denied fundamental human freedoms, and that we will never, ever become comfortable or adjust to an America or any community that lacks the opportunity for a decent life for any citizen who is able and willing to work for it. Would all of you think in your own minds and consider joining me, if you haven't already, in committing to being maladjusted until we see true renewal and transformation in our nation? We are right, I think, to expect enterprise, thrift, and self-reliance in all of our fellow citizens. I think we ought to work. But we must insist that those expected responsibilities be coupled with an authentic, sincere concern for the welfare of every citizen, irrespective of race, religion, gender, ethnicity, or any other label that we can slam on someone. It is a fact, I am truly convinced that it is a fact, where people are separate from each other when they are angry, when they are polarized, and when they're defensive, breakdown and disorder always follow. The way to heal social disorders is to reintroduce community and mutual concern. Shouldn't all of us as citizens participate in having honest conversations on matters of race, reconciliation, and responsibility? Don't all of us have a role in choosing to move beyond blame and guilt, beyond hatred and fear, deciding to face the past with courage and with honesty? Shouldn't we be willing to embrace each other's painful experiences and be so sensitive to others and their painful experiences that if any individual is injured, exploited, or demeaned, it would cause the rest of us to feel the pain and be diminished? Should not each of our communities, whether it's Wichita, Kansas, whether it's Manhattan, Kansas, whether it's New York City or Fresno, shouldn't each of our communities in America be a place where every heart could put down roots and where every single person feels accepted and at home? My view is that if we truly feel this way, and if we're sufficiently committed to these principles, we can literally change our nation and our nation's communities. Everyone in this room and all of our neighbors know what we should stand for, and we know what we should oppose. Our task now, I believe, is to turn from talking the talk to walking the walk. My most heartfelt wish and hope is that our nation and all of our communities would have the vision, the humility, the repentant spirit, and the regard for each other to drink collectively together ever so deeply from the well of reconciliation and become a united America. I believe that we have to have a resolute determination to work toward repairing the wounds in our individual and collective souls. We must be prepared to apply ourselves to this most serious condition with a concentration and with a sense of purpose that we don't normally summon most of the time. Last Friday evening, Dr. Cornel West, who many of you are familiar with, was in Wichita to formally initiate our community study circles on racism. I have been on several panels this year with Dr. West. For those of you that may not know him, he is a professor from Harvard. He is a theologian. He is a philosopher. I think he is one of 22 full professors at Harvard out of an enormously large faculty. This guy has a soaring intellect. Now this is a university community, so maybe you're used to people of this caliber. I'm not. I was truly moved and truly motivated, and I will tell you that every citizen who had the opportunity to hear Cornel left at least a little bit changed, regardless of how hardened their heart was when they came. What a powerful person that he is. I don't know if he's ever spoken at this series, but and I don't know that you would even agree with me. But in having several extended conversations with him during the year, I think he's pretty well summarized some of the choices we have as a society and certainly as various communities. He's of the opinion that we have the choice of true integration or disintegration. He's of the view that we can choose community or we can choose chaos. So we do have some choices. He's also a very guarded optimist because he is such a realist. He thinks that there is at least a possibility we may be witnessing the advent of the internal collapse of our society. It is a fact that other nations, very powerful nations, have fallen when they were unwilling or unable to change when historical conditions demanded. Our history is replete with evidence that we should have changed a long, long time ago. Our history is replete with evidence that we were not responding when there was the most authentic, deeply felt pleas for inclusion and participation. Surely we're not so presumptive or we're not so arrogant to believe that we're immune to the very radical consequences which will surely visit a consistently divided people. In closing, let me say that Cornel West also believes that the greatest divide in our nation is not between city and suburb or rural or north or south, but rather it's the divide by those trapped by grievances and preconceptions of the past and those who have the vision and courage to shape the future. I can't tell you how honored I am to have been invited to address you. I will tell you, however, once again, that this is not some emotional phase in my life that I'm passing through. I intend to stay involved with this issue the rest of my life, and I would assume that most of that would be, at least in the future, out of public office. But it is not some passing emotional experience. I want to thank all of you for what you do for others, and particularly to the young people who are in this audience. I don't know if you're here because you had to do a book report or some kind of extra credit work, but I am very impressed that you would spend part of your evening here rather than in Aggieville or somewhere else. I am so encouraged and fortified with the young people that I speak to on a very regular basis in Wichita. hopefully their worldview and the worst aspects of our worldview will be the predominant features of the future, their thinking instead of some of the thinking that has shackled us. But again, I want to thank you, and I would try to respond to any questions you might have. I will tell you that I am spending a lot of my time in Wichita on this subject. I happen to think that we're a great city, but clearly there are men and women in Wichita who can trace their history back, and I was born and raised there, but they can trace their history back several generations farther in that city than I can trace mine, and they feel as though there's an inner circle of privilege in our community, and they're not a part of it. And that just breaks my heart. And so I'm spending, hopefully, trying to walk the walk in Wichita rather than just coming to some community that's away from home and talking the talk. I think the real test is what happens, as far as my life is concerned, with my responsibilities in Wichita. And I think that's the way I ought to be measured. And so thank you very much for your attention, and I would try to address several questions if you have any, except from my brother-in-law. Thank you. Yes, there's a question over here.
What are the policy approaches that you support, recommend, advocate to promote racial justice?
Well, there's several. I think there's a variety of questions concerning not just social justice but economic justice, and I suppose that they may be different for different communities. I'm working on an issue that I think represents economic justice in Wichita that most of you would have an exact opposite view on. But I've spent a lot of time on it. I believe that my assumptions are correct, and I think I've been called to do what I can do to represent the underdogs. But I think that on a national scale, in terms of economic policy, we're seeing a growing divide between the haves and the have-nots in the most powerful and the wealthiest country in the world. And I'm dismayed that very little, I think in the second debate there was some talk about the racial divide, and somebody segued into the digital divide and told us how much they knew about computer technology. But I think we have to have honest conversations. Our strategy in Wichita is to start study circles where 8 to 10 citizens who don't know each other from various economic and social, ethnic, racial backgrounds commit to 2 hours a week for 4, 5, 6 weeks with a facilitator, trained facilitator, and really talk and get to know each other and know about some of the soaring triumphs in their lives and victories and hopes and dreams, but also the pain. And you know, it's not reasonable, and it's not even logical that we would ask people who have been mistreated to forget those experiences. However, I think that's an entirely different request than asking forgiveness. Forgiving is not forgetting. But that requires a change from me to you if you're the one that's suffered as a result of something that I've done. I think that the first step is getting to know each other and talking to each other. And I was asked today by a friend of my niece's who is a reporter for is it the Collegian? She wanted to know, what do you see a year, 2 years, 3 years? And I told her, I said, you know, I feel kind of like a runner that doesn't know where the finish line is. I don't know where the finish line is, and I don't know the perfect prescription or the perfect antidote, to hate. But I do know that as you engage with other human beings and get to know them, generally we don't treat each other the same. We've changed each other in some way. So I happen to believe in the fact that we're fit for self-government, but so critical in that assumption is the fact that we can live together and we can not only look out for our own interest, but express mutuality whenever possible. That's what a community is all about. You're not unrelated strangers, you're neighbors. And so I don't know how other cities are going to handle it. What we're doing is nothing particularly novel or unique. We've borrowed it from other cities around the country. But I'm excited about it. At least people are talking about it. Now, some don't want to talk about it, and a lot of the talk that's directed to me is very negative. You know, why don't you leave it alone? Why are you, going into a hornet's nest? Just leave it alone. It's kind of like, don't pick the scab. Well, sometimes you have to clean out the wound and put on a new dressing, and it doesn't mean you won't have to clean it out again and again. But for healing to occur, I think we have to be talking to each other. And thank God there are a lot of people smarter than me that can give some guidance and share wisdom in this area. But I really feel like I'm called to just bring up the subject and let's quit acting like everything's fine when it's not fine. Yes, sir.
I'm curious to know, is there also been, along with public policy initiatives, has there also been maybe supported, because of all of our civic structures are based upon developing this community, which you said and alluded to is becoming fragmented all the time. Has there been community-based kind of initiatives that have been kind of coinciding with things which you have been trying to initiate from City Hall as a whole? Are there some examples that you can even share within Wichita
Sure.
that are kind of standing with you as you're running?
It's an excellent question. There are some things that I can influence. I can influence the way City Hall looks. The municipal corporation of the city of Wichita ought to look like the community. You ought to see different colors and different genders and leadership, and as you go through that organization. We have some work to do. I think we've done a pretty good job in recent years, but we still have a ways to go. We've had concerns expressed to me about racial profiling. I think we have an outstanding police department, but you cannot turn a deaf ear like we've turned, throughout a lot of our history in America and certainly in my own community and perhaps even here. So we're looking at that issue. There's some housing questions that we're looking at. People trying to buy or rent housing, at least it's been brought to my attention, the color of your skin has played a significance that it oughtn't play. So there's some things like that. We have our spiritual community through Interfaith Ministries is involved in a program called the Crossroads Program, which is a fairly long-term commitment to working through these issues of racism. So yeah, there are some things that are dovetailing and may even turn out to be far more significant and important than anything I'm doing. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I know since I've been in Kansas, I was in class and I had two girls mention the word they called colored. So I knew that in Kansas, maybe in some of these smaller communities, they weren't really aware of the black experience at all. But one thing I wanted to point out was that too often the definition of racism as an institution has not been defined as inclusive of power. Usually the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or the white Anglo-Saxon is the only utilizer of this power and has access to this power. In all facets of the American social structure, and that's inclusive of politics, economics, education, religious, and the institution of family. To undo racism, realistically, we have to undo America. That is the redistribution of power in economics, a redistribution of wealth, and equal access to this power. Being that most of dealing with economics, 1% of the wealth is owned by, 1% of the population owns 46% of the wealth. So I was wondering, do you agree with me that we cannot move on to a cure until we have educated about the illness that has been caused by racism?
I think you said it far better than I can say it. I think your math is a little fuzzy. Are those Al Gore's figures? No, I think what you say is true. You know, I probably didn't say it very well, but I do think that we're going to have to see a transformation in a lot of institutions because the effects of racism have profoundly influenced so many institutions. You know, you're probably getting into an area that would be better served by talking about it in class with people that know an awful lot more about economic policy, even though it's an interest of mine. I don't, again, profess to be an economist, but clearly racism has affected almost all of America and its institutions. In terms of your remedy, I don't know. My hope is that there is hope for America and there is hope for confronting this. I don't think you can even get to the point you're talking about, though, until you start talking to each other. And of course everything is justifiably examined in something like that. But that doesn't answer your question, but I think you're quite prepared by your experiences to answer, and far better for yourself than anything I could say. Yes, sir?
You talked about reintroducing community and a genuine concern. And I was wondering, how do you, you've done some things, but what kind of advice can you give to us here to kind of get people to commit to these common principles and issues of just being culturally competent, not dealing with just black and white, but just being culturally competent on the whole?
Well, one of the real opportunities in this very diverse society, it's growing more diverse each day, has been through local government. If you look at the composition of local government throughout America, you're going to see a radically different context than what you saw 10, 15, 20 years ago. You have many minorities that have risen through their aptitude, their determination, and their unrelenting effort to place themselves in position where they could start influencing policies. And you're seeing it more and more, and I happen to think that that's the democratic way. I think that you have opportunities daily in the way you conduct your life. You know, if you're a person, which you certainly appear to be, a man of principle, a man that conducts his life around those principles, you're influencing a lot of people. By the same token, when I slip and stumble and fall, I also have an effect on people. So I think that I think change is possible, and I think that there's change occurring, but it won't be a pervasive change until we engage much larger segments of our population, whether it's in Wichita or whether it's in this nation. And when you have the top elected leaders in the country that shy away from really true conversations about this, it makes that all the more difficult. Last March in Washington, President Clinton affirmed what we were trying to do with this issue in America. And he was very eloquent, and he has been a real friend to minorities. I mean, if you look at his administration, I think it would have to be the most diverse of any administration in history. I mean, I can't imagine one that would be more reflective of that. But he could do more. You know, he is so effective and so influential and so eloquent that he could do a lot more. But he had an effort several years ago and found out that it's a very difficult issue, and there aren't a lot of political payoffs for people like me talking about this subject. And that, I guess it depends on what's important in a person's life. But I am still convinced that Margaret Mead was right. A small group of sufficiently committed men and women can do extraordinary things. And so again, I'll do some loud singing if people will listen, and we'll see where it ends up. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your uplifting comments. You indicated that you don't know exactly where the finish line is, but are there ways that a year from now or 5 years from now you will be able to look at Wichita or at other cities across the country and decide whether some of this vision has been achieved? What would be the measures of success?
Well, I do. I think that I have enough experience in participation in Wichita to have a sense of the tone and the mood of that community. And I will tell you that I am very proud of most of the citizens of the city of Wichita. By and large, this has been well received. However, it doesn't take too many people to make it very difficult. The way the city of Wichita looks, again, let's just take something you can measure and quantify and verify, and that's the city of Wichita itself. We've tried to engage the business community, and to date they've been very responsive. I hope we see more management opportunities throughout our community in higher positions. But there are a variety of measurements that you can apply to a community, and I suppose the same thing is true with the nation. I'm just not qualified to be commenting too much on that level of measurement. But I do think that you can look at a community. I mean, talk to your friends, talk to people. I've had people tell me over and over. I was invited by the cities of Idaho to speak in Coeur d'Alene this summer, and that was an interesting experience. I don't know if any of you have been there, but it just has astonishing beauty. It's just a wonderful, wonderful place. But it also represents a kind of a bastion for supremacist thinking. So that was kind of an eye-opener to me. But I walked away from that community with such an enormous appreciation and admiration for the local elected officials there. I mean, that to me is what courage is all about. It's what principle, decency, and standing up for your neighbors. And I felt as though some of the men and women that lived there also had a deep appreciation for it. The greatest appreciation that has been expressed to me has been from minorities. And in my community, I am typically not viewed in this light. I think it's taken a while for people to, what's this guy doing that for? I mean, here's a guy that has spent a large part of his career on trying to find efficiencies and economies in government, promoting industry, all the things that, quote, my label say I'm supposed to do. And here he is spending an awful lot of his time on this kind of issue. He's kind of gone off the deep end. And that takes some time. I think that I think people are pretty well convinced by now, though. And but the real test to me will be Wichita. And there is an enormous talent pool throughout this nation in local government. Just amazing. I mean, Karen can tell you. You go to our national meetings, and you know, you have college professors. You'll have, I suppose, you've had professors here sit on the local governing body, but KU, you've had them. You know, you go to Charlotte, and you go to you know, California cities, and you have physicists and mathematicians and social scientists, and there's an incredible pool of talent there, and we have to figure out how we can apply this energy and this intellect toward this very vexing problem. But I guess in my simple way of looking at the world, what is really going to be required is a change of hearts. And you can have everything else, but if you have a hard heart, it's kind of hard to pierce that. I want to again thank all of you. My brother-in-law Rod has very generously invited all of you out for dinner tonight. And you know him well enough to know this is pretty typical of him. And if you, for whatever reason, can't go out with us, he'll be glad to give you $25 vouchers. You can use it later date. But thank you very much for inviting me.